my name's Sam and I'm one of the diabetes dietitians here at Worthing Hospital.
Hello, my name's Karen. I'm one of the diabetes dietitians here as well. Today we're going to talk about diabetes in pregnancy, and Sam is going to start. First of all, she's going to talk us through what happens in the body with gestational diabetes. Over to you, Sam.
Okay, so we're just going to do a little rundown of what's happening in the body when someone has gestational diabetes or diabetes in pregnancy. So first of all, we need to think about why do we eat and where do we get our energy from. So we eat to get energy, and the foods that we tend to get most of our energy from are carbohydrate foods. So that covers things like bread, sweet foods like cakes, we've got sugary drinks here, we've got potatoes, fruit, a whole raft of things, and Karen's going to cover those in a little bit more detail later on. So once we eat these foods, these carbohydrate foods, they're broken down into sugar in the body, in the stomach, and released into the bloodstream. Once that sugar is in the bloodstream, here we are, after it's been digested in the stomach, we need to get that sugar out of the bloodstream and into all the cells and the muscles of the body to give us energy to do all the things that we want to do throughout the day. But we can't get that sugar into the muscles and the cells on its own. We need a little helper, and that helper is insulin. And insulin is made by the pancreas in response to rising blood sugar levels. And what insulin essentially does, if we use the analogy of the keys, a lock and a key, insulin acts like a key to open up the locks on the cells, to let them in, to let the sugar in, to give the body energy. What's happening though in gestational diabetes is that the pancreas is still making that insulin in response to those rising blood sugar levels, but it's not working as efficiently. Something in the body is happening called insulin resistance, and that insulin resistance is caused by the hormones that are released by the placenta in pregnancy. We typically see this starting off at its greatest level in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, which is why you have that glucose tolerance test, and that's generally how many of you will have been diagnosed. There's lots of ways that we can try and manage this. One way is to alter the diet, and that's really what today's session is going to be focusing on. The foods that affect blood sugar levels, portion sizes of those foods, and potentially some swaps that you can make. So one food might be better than another for your blood sugar levels in pregnancy. There are also medications that can be used to manage your blood sugar levels in pregnancy. And we'd say about half of our ladies manage to control their blood sugar levels in pregnancy just with dietary changes alone. But the other half do need a little bit of help with medications, and that's no bad thing. That's just what happens to some of our ladies, and it's not anything that we can really predict. In terms of when we decide to go on to medications, that's really led by those blood tests that you do. So the blood test that you do before breakfast, first thing in the morning, and the blood test that you do 1 hour after your meals, which your nurse or midwife will tell you more about. In terms of the targets that we're aiming for less than 5.3 in the blood sugar before your breakfast and less than 7.8 after your meals. If we're unable to achieve those readings with changes to the diet, then that's when we would start off on the medications.
Thanks very much, Sam. Okay, so next we're going to be looking at the different food groups and seeing which of them contain carbohydrate. So, first of all, we're going to look at this section, which is called the starchy carbohydrate section. So this includes foods such as breakfast cereals, foods such as pasta. Here we have rice. Here we have a slice of pizza, some mashed potato, foods such as chapati and also samosas. And naan breads would count there as well, and then foods like noodles and chips and things made from potato. So this section of foods, if you ask the typical person on the street, what are carbs? These are the sorts of foods that first tend to come to mind. And these foods sometimes get a bit of a bad press, but actually they provide our body with useful nutrients. So for example, as Sam pointed out earlier on, carbohydrates break down to energy, and we do need a certain amount of energy and glucose every day. The other thing that these foods provide is fibre, which is very handy in pregnancy for preventing constipation. And when you pick whole grain varieties of these foods particularly, they do contain some useful minerals and vitamins which will help baby to grow successfully and to keep you well. So the thing about these foods that we're going to talk about later is the type and the portion sizes, because with these foods, because the carbohydrate breaks down to glucose, if you have large portions of these foods at meals, you may find 1 hour later when you do your finger prick test that it's very hard to control those blood sugars and keep them in target. So we'll talk later on about the correct portion sizes for these foods. Now let's move on and look at the next section. Now we're going to talk about these foods, fruits and vegetables, and also we include in this section salad. So we know that these foods are good for us, and you may have heard of trying to get your 5 a day. And the reason that the government suggests aiming for 5 or more portions of fruit and vegetables a day are because they contain lots of minerals, lots of vitamins, lots of fibre, and also we can get some of our fluid intake from our fruits and vegetables. So we would definitely encourage you to include these foods in your diet when you're pregnant. The one key thing to remember though is that fruits contain carbohydrate. So that natural sweetness that you get from fruit, which isn't present in vegetables, always comes from the carbohydrates in them. So it's just important to have a think about, if we are aiming for our 5 a day, how many of those should be fruit. And we would suggest 2 to 3 portions of fruit per day would be about what we're aiming for, and then to try and get the rest from vegetables or from salad. If we think about fruit, we will talk a little bit later on about how to portion that out throughout the day, but essentially we're trying to avoid having lots of fruit all at one point, because again then it might be more challenging to keep your blood sugars within that target range. Let's move on and look at the dairy foods now. And dairy foods include things like milk, yogurt, cream and cheeses. Now these foods can be a little bit confusing in terms of carbohydrate, and the reason for that is that some of them contain carbohydrates and some don't. So our milk and our yogurts are primarily the types of dairy foods that contain carbohydrate. However, they also contain some fat and some protein. And so generally speaking, milk won't have a very large effect on your blood sugar levels if you're sticking to moderate sized portions. Certainly if you drank a whole pint of milk at once, you might see some effect on your blood sugar levels, but with a glass, it's only about 7 grams of carbohydrate. It shouldn't have a big effect. So if we think about why we would include these foods in the diet for pregnancy, they have lots of benefits. So for instance, they contain protein, they contain calcium, which is good for helping grow babies' teeth and bones, and also they contain something called iodine. And iodine is very helpful for babies' brain development. So we would certainly encourage you to be aiming for 3 portions of these foods per day. A portion would be, for example, a yogurt pot about this size, about 125 grams, a glass of milk that is about 200 millilitres, or a piece of cheese about the size of a matchbox, or any combination of those. So for example, if you had 2 glasses of milk and a piece of cheese, that would be ensuring that you're getting enough calcium for the day. Now some people choose to avoid these products. It may be because they're vegan, or it may be because of cultural reasons, or perhaps they find that some dairy foods give them a bit of an upset tummy. In that case, feel free to use milk alternatives, so things like soya milk, oat milk, nut milks, cashew milks, things like this are on the market now. But if you choose to use those products, just be aware that ideally you're looking for some that are fortified with calcium, and that means they have calcium added to them, and also that have iodine added to them if you can find those products. Let's have a look at the protein foods now. And these include things like meat, poultry, so chicken and turkey, includes things like fish and canned fish, like tuna, for example. Ham would come under the protein section too. We've also got some vegetarian and vegan alternatives such as tempeh or tofu. These foods come under protein as well. And of course, let's not forget eggs. Eggs are also a protein food. And then we also have things like lentils and split peas and pulses. So quite a lot of different foods here in the protein section. But actually, these foods really won't affect your blood sugar levels very much. They don't really break down to glucose, and they have a very minimal effect on your blood sugar levels. It's good to include these foods in our diet because they can provide us with minerals such as calcium and iron, and they can also help to keep us full with a meal. So we would definitely suggest including them a couple of times a day at least. The protein also helps you to grow babies' muscles within the womb. When we're thinking about foods like beans and pulses, so for example, kidney beans or chickpeas, these are actually a really good thing to be including on a regular basis when you have diabetes in pregnancy. And later on, Sam will talk about why that is. Now we're going to move on and we're going to look at the fats and oils sections. So these are typically foods that you might, for example, spread on bread, or you might be using them when you're cooking a chili. You might start with a pan and some oil and some onion and garlic. So these foods will not directly affect your blood sugar levels. So then we need to think about them though also in terms of health. So for example, if we have lots of these foods, really big portions, then that might lead to some unintentional extra weight gain during pregnancy, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. In terms of choosing which of these foods we go for, ideally go for the heart healthy versions. So that's having less of things like, for example, butter or ghee or lard, and trying to choose heart healthy alternatives. So that could be things like rapeseed oil, it could be things like sunflower oil, or the spreads that are made from those. So finally, let's have a look now at foods that are high in added fat and high in sugars. So these are things like crisps, for example, fruit juice, chocolates, croissants and cakes. We also have things like chocolate bars there, little cake bars, biscuits for example, and also things like honey. And some sauces that we have with foods can be high in added sugar too, so things like Hunter's chicken or having jam or marmalade or mango chutney. All of these foods are quite high in added sugar. And the problem with that is that these foods are going to increase your blood sugar levels. Sometimes they can have quite a dramatic effect on your blood sugar levels during pregnancy. So it's really important with these foods that we try and limit them as much as we can. Now I know that can be really difficult if you're at work, for example, somebody's birthday and they bring in lots of lovely cakes, or if you're stopping for petrol at a service station and somebody says, would you like a chocolate bar for £1? I do realise it's very hard to sometimes avoid these foods in our society these days. But it's important to. So for example, these fruity jelly sweets, one of those contains 1 teaspoon of sugar. It's quite a lot, isn't it? I know that certainly when I've opened a packet before, it's very hard to stop at just one. They're quite moreish and it's very easy to keep going. So if you think about one of these packs, they contain about 30 of those sweets. So if you eat the whole thing, you've had 30 teaspoons of sugar. So when we think about how these foods affect baby, they contain very few vitamins or minerals. So there's another reason to maybe consider trying to limit them in pregnancy as much as you possibly can. And with things like cooking sauces, we really want to be looking on the labels. And later on, we'll talk through how to look at food labels and work out how much sugar is in those products.
Okay, so Karen's gone through all the different types of foods in the diet and covered the foods that will and won't affect the blood sugar levels. What I'm going to go through now is the portion sizes that we'd recommend for those foods that affect our blood sugar levels. So we're really looking at these starchy carbohydrate portions in this next section. So for some foods, it's easier than others to figure out what the portion size is. Some foods come as a set portion. So for example, things like bagels or bread, it's quite easy to look at that as a set portion. So a portion for a bagel would be 1 bagel. And for our breads, it would be 2 slices of bread as 1 portion. Moving on to our potatoes here, we've got mashed potato, and this is actually about the right size that we'd recommend for our mashed potato. And when we're thinking about boiled potatoes, we're looking at 2 or 3 egg-sized potatoes as 1 portion. We've then got our noodles here, so we've got 1 nest size for our noodles, and that's quite handy as that's how they often come in the packets. Moving on then to our pasta and our rice, it's quite tricky to portion these out because we tend to think of them as a whole meal, and we might sort of base a whole meal around them. So for example, something like a pasta bake or a paella, then the carbohydrate part is really the biggest part of the meal. And it's not to say that you can't have these foods anymore, but we need to think about it as more of a component of the meal rather than the whole meal. So thinking about what else might be on the plate, for example. So we'd recommend that our starchy carbohydrates, when we're plating them up, are around about 1/4 of our plate here, with the remainder of the plate being around about 1/4 of our protein and half to be vegetables. And that can include things like salads and beans and pulses as well. If you find that that's a little bit too much vegetables for you, maybe that's a big increase on what you're having already, you can have a little bit more protein because it doesn't affect blood sugar levels and can help you to feel fuller for longer as well. We appreciate that you don't eat off plates like this, although they're very handy, they're nice and sectioned out. So we've put together some portions for you to have a look at here. So here we have roughly the recommended portion size for pasta and the recommended portion size for rice. And a really good handy measure when you're plating up your meals is that fist size portion. And that comes in really useful when we're thinking about cereals, for example, because we can't plate up a quarter plate of cereal. That would be very challenging. So here we have bran flakes, and that's approximately a fist-sized portion there. And then here we have corn flakes. So it's a little bit bigger than the fist-sized portion because it's a little bit of a lighter cereal there. We've also plated up a few meals for you to look at, just so you can get a bit of an idea about the different components of the meal, so the vegetables, the protein and the carbs, and how that might look when it's plated up. So here we have a shepherd's pie portion with the mashed potatoes on top, the mince underneath and the vegetables around the side. We've here got a portion of beef, tomatoes and some mashed potato to give you a bit of an idea for that. And finally, we've got some chilli here, and we've served that with a jacket potato. So you can see that jacket potato there is approximately that fist size that we spoke about before. So now we're going to talk about glycemic index, or GI. So glycemic index really is a measure, and what it measures is how quickly a carbohydrate food is broken down into sugar. And that's important because it will affect how much and how quickly it affects our blood sugar levels. Broadly speaking, we just talk about high and low GI. It's actually rated on a numbering system, but we don't need to be worrying too much about that. It's just whether a food is high or low GI that's important for our purposes. So a food that is high GI is essentially a carbohydrate that's broken down into its sugar form very quickly. And when that happens, it has a very rapid and significant effect on the blood sugar levels. So we tend to see a really rapid rise with a high peak 1 to 2 hours after our meal, and then we see a really rapid fall subsequently after that. And when our blood sugar levels go up and down, it affects how we feel in terms of our energy and our appetite. So when we eat one of these high GI foods, initially we feel like we've had enough and we feel quite full, and we feel a bit of a burst of energy, that sugar rush feeling that some people talk about. But as the blood sugar levels drop, and as they drop quite quickly, we can feel quite hungry and quite lethargic quite soon after eating. And often we get a real craving for something quite sweet and quite sugary, which happens to be high GI, and we get that same thing happening again with that rapid rise. So in gestational diabetes, we want to ideally avoid these high GI foods as much as possible. So that includes things like white bread, mashed potatoes, the vast majority of cereals, so the obviously sugary or chocolatey ones here, but some of the less obvious ones like cornflakes and Rice Krispies are broken down into sugar very quickly. Again, the obvious things like sweets and sugary drinks, but also things like chips, jams and fruit juice as well can have quite a significant effect on the blood sugar levels. On the opposite end of the scale, we've got our low GI foods. So these foods are carbohydrates that are broken down into sugars much more gradually. So they're broken down in the gut really nice and slowly, and rather than a big surge of sugar into the bloodstream, it's a bit more like a trickling effect. And that's really helpful when our insulin isn't working as effectively as it should. It gives the body a little bit more time to deal with that sugar in the blood and keep the blood sugar levels a bit more steady. So these low GI foods are broken down much more slowly. We see a much more gradual rise and fall in the blood sugar levels, and the peak tends to be a lot lower as well. These lower GI foods are actually really helpful for a few reasons in gestational diabetes, because they help you to feel fuller for longer and they help you to keep your energy levels up for longer. This is really useful when we're trying to reduce our portion sizes of carbohydrates and avoid snacking in between meals. Some examples of some low GI foods are listed here. So we've got our granary and rye breads, and also rye crackers can make a really good snack. We've got anything oat-based, so oat cakes and porridge oats is a really good cereal to try. The vast majority of fruit is low GI, and that includes dried fruit as well, with the exception of things like dates. We've then got other grains, for example, things like couscous is a good low GI example. Pasta, and it's all pasta, not just the wholemeal and brown varieties, are a good example of a low GI food. We just have to be really careful with the portion sizes. Sweet potato is a good alternative to regular potatoes, especially if you found that they're causing your blood sugar levels to go high. And it doesn't matter so much whether it's boiled or mashed or roasted, it's all a good choice. With our rice, it's the basmati or the brown rice that would be a better choice. And then we've got some other starchy vegetables like yams there. So you can see there's lots of different types of foods listed here. And you can see that it's different types of foods that can decide whether it's high or low GI. But also the cooking method affects the glycemic index. So for example, with potatoes, it's the mashed potatoes that are high GI, and boiled potatoes would be a bit lower. And the reason for this is the fibre content. So generally speaking, the higher the fibre a food is, the lower the GI will be, because fibre slows down digestion. Something else that slows down digestion is fat and protein. So if we include some fat and protein at a meal, that can help lower the GI of a meal overall. So we've gone through the high and the low GI foods, and hopefully that's given you a few ideas for some swaps that you might be able to make. I just want to finally mention beans and pulses. These foods are actually very low GI, so come under this line here. And that's because these foods are really high in fibre, so they're broken down really, really slowly and are really useful for helping us to feel fuller for longer. It's important to say that this isn't a complete list of all the different foods, so if you want a little bit more information, you can refer to your booklet, pages 8 to 10.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, so now we're going to talk about breakfast, and we're also going to talk more generally about meal patterns and some snack ideas. So when we think about breakfast and when we work with ladies with diabetes in pregnancy, we sometimes find that breakfast has that 1 hour test afterwards, that 1 hour blood sugar test, and that can be quite a tricky one to control in terms of the blood sugar tests we're asking you to do throughout the day. So where possible, it's important with breakfast to think again about our carbohydrate portions and also about the GI, the glycemic index of our foods. And if you want some helpful suggestions, then in your booklet, on page 7, we have lots of different suggestions for healthy breakfasts. For instance, you can try something like a 2-egg omelette with cheese, tomatoes, onion and spinach with some potatoes or with a slice of medium toast. You can think about something like 30 grams of granola with 100 grams of milk and 50 grams of raspberries. Or here we have something simple like 1 slice of medium or wholemeal toast with half a can of baked beans. So lots and lots of suggestions for you there. Sometimes if you're cutting down your portion sizes, so for example, if that's a much smaller breakfast than you're used to, then there can be a problem because you could feel extra hungry between meals, and that's where snacks come in. So let me tell you a little story about a patient that I once saw who had gestational diabetes. So this was a very busy lady. She had 2 young children already. And in the mornings, she would get the kids' breakfast ready and then only have time for maybe 1 piece of toast, and she would fly out the door to work. She would then work through her lunch, a very busy office, not really have time to stop, and she'd probably have something like a banana for her lunch. And then when she came through the door and got home at about 6 o'clock in the evening, I'm sure you can imagine what happened. She was absolutely famished and therefore used to eat a really, really big portion with her evening meal and then really struggled with that 1 hour test 1 hour after her evening meal. She'd always find with that blood test that she'd be on the high side for her blood sugar levels. So what's really, really helpful for diabetes in pregnancy is to try and take more of a little and often approach with your meals. Ideally, we are aiming for 3 main meals each day and then a small snack in between your breakfast and lunch, another snack between your lunch and your evening meal, and some ladies also might need a snack before bed. So you might be wondering, well, what kind of snacks can I have? Okay, so let's have a think about what we've already talked about. We've already talked about fruit and that it's beneficial because it contains vitamins and minerals, but it also contains carbohydrate. So if you'd like to choose fruit as a snack, we would suggest going for a portion that's about the size of your hand. So that would be something like 1 apple, a couple of plums or satsumas, or maybe sort of 8 to 10 grapes, something around that size, and that would be counted as one portion of fruit. And again, we would want to have our portions of fruit spaced out throughout the day. There are other snacks that we can have as well as fruit though, and here I've got some examples of things we could try. So for instance, things like olives can be very, very helpful. They're quick and easy. You can get them in brine and then you can just pop them into a little Tupperware or something like this to take with you. Salad items such as cherry tomatoes or cucumber sticks or little baby carrots that you can get. Again, you can buy these ready done now if you want to save time, or if you want to save money, you can chop these up yourself and take them with you to work or if you're out and about. And sometimes it's good to have dips with those things to make them a little less plain. So you could have dips, for example, such as hummus or guacamole or a little bit of mayonnaise or low-fat mayonnaise. If we're thinking about nuts, nuts again have a very minimal effect on your blood sugar levels. They are high in calories, so where we're thinking about nuts, we would probably want to choose about that size portion, about what you can fit in your hand. But they're good for filling us up because they're high in protein. The other thing to bear in mind with nuts is we would generally suggest trying to go for the unsalted ones if you can. The reason for that being that in pregnancy, sometimes it's a slightly riskier time for high blood pressure, and so we don't want to be having lots and lots of extra salty snacks. So where you can, go for the plainer nuts. If we're thinking about something a little more substantial, you could have something like a couple of oat cakes, for example, or a cracker or a Rivita as a snack. And again, you could put something on that. So you could have that with ham or have it with cheese or some of the dips that we talked about earlier on. If we're thinking about a yogurt, we might just want to think about the types of yogurts that we would suggest. And this is where it's really handy to be able to look at the labels and go for a lower sugar alternative where you can. So a lot of yogurts are flavoured with fruit, and that will mean that they're a little bit higher in carbohydrates and therefore will have more of an effect on your blood sugar levels than, for example, Greek yogurts or plain natural yogurt. Avocado can also be a handy snack to think about, and again you could have that with crackers or have it half an avocado on its own if you like that. And again, avocado doesn't really have much of an effect on your blood sugar levels because there's not much carbohydrate in here. Peanut butter or other nut butters can also be useful additions to snacks. So for example, you could have those again on crisp breads or perhaps on oat cakes as we discussed earlier. Where you can, look at the label and try to go for lower sugar versions. I just wanted to add in another little note about drinks. So the drinks that we're having throughout the day can have an effect on our blood sugar levels. So for example, if you're choosing drinks such as milkshakes or you're choosing drinks such as full sugar fizzy drinks or orange juice or smoothies, these are essentially broken down versions of sugar. They get absorbed very quickly into our bloodstream and can cause big spikes in our blood sugar levels. So where you can, we would always suggest trying water as a first alternative. If you don't like water very much and you find it a bit plain, then you could choose things such as no added sugar or low sugar squash. You could choose things such as light versions of drinks. So this light blackcurrant drink, for example, is very, very low in sugars. Or if you really, really love fizzy drinks, then we would suggest going for something like the diet version, the zero version, or max. They all have different names these days, but if you have a little look on the label, you'll soon be able to identify which ones are the low sugar versions. With fizzy drinks, just a note of caution, we just need to be mindful that some contain caffeine, which we know we have to limit slightly in pregnancy, and also that they're not good for your teeth if you have lots of them. But if you really want that, fizzy treat, then we would suggest going for one of those perhaps per day. If you'd like a bit more information on snacks, we also have a lower carbohydrate snack list that we will be sending out for you, and this gives you lots and lots of suggestions, so I'm hopeful that you can find something on there that you would like. Right, and now over to Sam, who's going to talk about food labels.
So hopefully you found some of those snack and meal ideas helpful. What we're now going to have just a short look at is how to look at food labels. So this is really useful because the sugar content, which is what we're really looking for mostly when we're looking at food labels, can be hugely variable between products. There's the obviously sugary things like cakes and biscuits and sweets. There's not much point in looking at the food labels for those. We just want to try and cut back on them as much as possible. But things such as cereals, yogurts and cooking sauces can have a really variable amount of sugar in them. So it's really worthwhile just taking a few minutes to have a look at a couple of different versions and choose the lowest sugar one. You might not ever get everything to be low sugar, but you can certainly make a lot of sugar savings by looking at a few different labels. So now I've got a couple of examples of yogurt labels. So I'll just go through how you would look at the sugar content to help make some informed decisions when you're choosing your yogurts, for example. So here we have a food label for a yogurt. You'll see that it's split up into all the different nutrients down this side here. You then will have something like per portion. For example, here it's per pot. And then you'll see per 100 grams. When we're trying to look to see if something is low sugar or high sugar, it's the per 100 grams that we need to be looking at. This allows us to compare different products because the portion sizes may vary from one to another. When we're looking at sugar content, we're looking here at the of which sugars, and we're looking at the per 100 grams. So you can see here, this item is 13.7 grams of sugar in 100 grams. So something that is low sugar is less than 5 grams of sugar in 100 grams. So you can see that this item is a little bit higher in sugar. So we might want to have a look at another label to see if we can get a lower sugar alternative. If we look at this label for this yogurt, as you can see, this one here is not quite low in sugar, so low in sugar being below 5 grams in 100, it's 9 grams of sugar per 100 grams. So although it's not low in sugar, it's still quite a bit lower than the other one. So it is really worthwhile having a look at a couple of different options because you can still save on the amount of sugar that you're having. So that was food labels. Hopefully you found that helpful, and it helps when you're going around the supermarket looking at labels. We're coming towards the end of our session now, and Karen is going to go through exercise, weight, and what happens after baby's born.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, so let's have a little think about activity and exercise during pregnancy. That can be a really useful thing to add in as another option, another strategy for how to help control our blood glucose levels during our pregnancy. So when we exercise or when we just do some activity, for example, going for a walk, that actually lowers our blood glucose levels. So it can be very, very helpful with diabetes in pregnancy to go for short walks, for example, after you eat for 10 to 15 minutes, and that can just help to lower our glucose levels. Other types of exercise that are suitable for pregnancy are most types of exercise, if I'm honest. So you can still go swimming. Some ladies still choose to go jogging. It's things like horse riding and contact sports that we need to avoid. But other than that, if you're feeling fit, you're feeling well, then absolutely, please do continue to exercise and to take activity during your pregnancy. That will help a lot. If you follow some of the steps that we've talked about today, you may find over the next few weeks that your weight starts to go down a little bit. And that can be a little bit frightening for some ladies who are pregnant. They get quite nervous about that, understandably so, because there's a lot of old wives' tales and myths out there about weight during pregnancy. What we know about our weight during pregnancy is that we don't want to gain excess weight. So it's good to gain an appropriate amount of weight, but we don't want to gain lots and lots. When we work with ladies with diabetes in pregnancy who do follow some of this food advice and maybe take some extra exercise, and they do lose a little bit of weight, we usually find that absolutely everything is fine with baby. And if need be, we can always do some extra scans to have a look at baby just to check that they're growing fine, but they're usually absolutely no problems. So if you do lose a little bit of weight, the key is not to panic, and if you're concerned about it, please do talk to your diabetes specialist midwife or do talk to your diabetes dietitian. What happens after baby's born? Well, we know that your risk of type 2 diabetes, if you have gestational diabetes, does go up. So you're much more at risk, unfortunately, of developing type 2 diabetes later in life. And so if you've made some changes to your lifestyle that you find aren't too difficult to carry on with, then we would suggest trying to carry on with those as much as possible. You know, healthier ways of eating, being active with baby once the baby's here. So that can be going out for walks in the pushchair if the weather's good. It can be maybe cutting down on some of those sugary foods that we talked about earlier. And those little tips and tricks can help to prevent the risk of type 2 diabetes coming on later in life. After baby's born, we will also ask that you do a blood test about 6 weeks postnatally just to make sure that the diabetes has gone away. It usually does. In the vast majority of cases, your diabetes goes away once the baby's born, but we just want to make sure. Right, so now we're going to talk about some frequently asked questions that we often have from ladies who have diabetes in pregnancy. There is actually a section in your booklet about frequently asked questions, and that starts on page 26, but we just thought we would talk about some of the most common ones that we often get. So a really good question that I get asked, Sam, by some ladies is, what do I do if I have really, really bad morning sickness? Could you shed a bit of light on that for me?
So it's really difficult. So we tend to find that morning sickness is usually more prevalent in the first trimester of pregnancy, but unfortunately for some ladies it does continue all the way through or into the latter stages of pregnancy. We then find that some ladies aren't able to follow the diet exactly as we would like them to do because there's only a handful of foods that they're able to manage. If that's the case, what we'd ask you to do is follow the diet as much as possible, really try and eliminate or reduce those sugary foods as much as you can, but if you're not able to do that and your blood sugar levels are high, then we do have to step in with some medication. And that's no bad thing. It's no reflection on you and the fact that you haven't worked hard. That's just how some pregnancies go, really.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful.
That's all right. We also get a lot of questions about diabetic foods and if these are helpful in pregnancy or for people with diabetes in general.
I'll jump in there if that's okay. So sometimes you get a situation where, say it's Easter or Christmas or your birthday, and a very well-meaning relative will go to a specialist food shop and buy you a big box of diabetic chocolates. Now, unfortunately, diabetic chocolates and products that are labelled as diabetic sometimes are still very high in fat and sometimes contain particular types of sweeteners that end in OL. So you may have seen them on packets before, things like xylitol, mannitol, sorbitol. And what we know about these from experience of working with ladies is that if you have a lot of those products, it can unfortunately lead to a bad tummy and diarrhea, which we really don't want to have on top of any other issues in pregnancy.
Absolutely not.
So generally speaking, we would say you don't need to spend the extra money on the diabetic products. You can just avoid those. We wouldn't recommend them really.
And oddly enough, I've seen a few biscuits, some ladies have brought them in, and because they're made of something starchy, they're actually higher in carbohydrates than a normal biscuit. So it's just a bit of a waste of money. Not what we'd recommend.
No. Now, final question that I'd like to ask you, Sam, today is sometimes ladies will be very diligent about doing their blood glucose checks as we ask them to. So they do that one first thing in the morning and then they do the 3 others 1 hour after each main meal. But sometimes they might notice a result that's under 4. Should they be worried about that?
Well, it depends on how you're feeling, really.
Okay.
So normal blood sugar levels are usually between 4 and 7 for someone without diabetes, but it's normal and natural for the body to dip below 4, especially if you haven't eaten for a long time or it's first thing in the morning. Provided that you're feeling well, it's generally nothing to worry about. It might even be that you haven't done the blood test quite right. Maybe there's a little bit of water left, so the blood's been diluted, or you haven't got quite enough blood on the strip. So if you feel well, it's usually nothing to worry about. If you are feeling a little bit shaky, that's a symptom of a low blood sugar. It might be a sign that you've left it too long since your last meal, or maybe you've cut down on the carbohydrates a little bit too much. And we want to strike a balance of not having so little carbohydrates just to get the blood sugar levels in range that you feel unwell and you're not eating enough, because it's important to eat enough of a variety of foods for your health and for baby's health. So if you are getting a lot of those low readings and you're feeling unwell, then do just mention it either to your diabetes nurse or midwife, your community midwife, or ourselves, one of the dietitians.
Perfect, thank you.
That's all right.
So it's really important from now on that you keep in close communication with your diabetes specialist midwives. So we would ask that you do those finger prick tests as best you can and then send by email those results if possible. If not, then you would want to telephone them if you don't have a computer at home, so that the midwives can have a look at what's happening with your sugar levels and make decisions from there as to what to do next, basically. In terms of our support, you will get a follow-up, and that with a dietitian, and that will be either a telephone call or face-to-face, and we will basically take that from there.
Yeah, we'll arrange that with you.
Yeah. So let's have a little summary of the things we've talked about today. The key points really: watch your starchy carbohydrate portions, think about choosing low GI foods, have a little look at food labels and try to pick low sugar versions of things like yogurts and cereal bars and cereals. Where you can, try to go for a meal pattern of 3 main meals and some small snacks in between. Try to stay active. Watch your fruit portions, so don't have a really big portion of fruit all at once. Make it a hand-sized portion and space it out throughout the day. Anything else I've missed there, Sam? Is that the kind of key summary?
I think that's pretty much it. And if you want to have a bit of a reminder on that, we appreciate it's a bit of information overload when you're first diagnosed with gestational diabetes. You have got your booklet. So here we have the booklet that you'll be either given in clinic or through the post. So it's our Healthy Eating in Gestational Diabetes booklet. And Karen also showed you the snack list as well, which we find is a really useful resource. And in terms of other useful websites, we've just popped a few up here for you to have a look at. So that will be some general advice for pregnancy as a whole, but also relating specifically to diabetes in pregnancy. But again, if you've got any questions or any concerns, do get in touch with us here in the Diabetes Centre. The helpline number and the helpline email will be on your pregnancy notes. But if it's something more specifically about baby, if you're worried that you're unwell or baby's not moving, anything at all, then get in touch with Antenatal Clinic.
So thank you ever so much for spending time with us today and joining us for this video. We hope that you found it really, really useful. If you have any questions, as Sam said, please do feel free to get in touch. And we look forward to seeing you again later on in your pregnancy, or if not, then best of luck for the rest of your pregnancy and have a wonderful time with your new baby. All right, thank you very much then.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.